It was late afternoon, and I was in my bedroom, sorting through some clothes when I heard the faint sound of the door creaking behind me. I turned, and there he was, Ethan, my 23-year-old stepson, standing in the doorway staring at me. My heart skipped a beat. In my hands was a harmless object, a trinket I had pulled out of the drawer to dust the back of the cabinet. It was nothing special, but I hadn't expected anyone to see it, especially not Ethan. The door should have been locked, or at least I thought it had been. I fumbled for something to cover it up, grabbing a pillow from the bed and holding it tightly against my chest. My mind raced as I tried to think of an excuse, but nothing came. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice playful yet inquisitive, his eyes fixed on the object I had just dropped. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment. "It's nothing, just mind your own business," I stammered, feeling a sudden tightness in my throat. But Ethan didn't look away. He didn't seem embarrassed at all. In fact, he leaned against the doorframe with an amused expression on his face. "You don't have to act like it's a big deal," he said, his smile widening. "It's not like I've never seen something like that before." I could feel my heart racing as I clutched the pillow harder. But his casual demeanor only made everything worse. He was acting like it was nothing, and that only heightened the pressure building inside me. My laugh came out forced, desperate to diffuse the tension. "Ethan, seriously, go mind your own business," I said, my voice trembling slightly. But he didn't move. Instead, he stood there, watching me with an intensity one had never seen before. The playful glint in his eyes was gone, replaced with something far more serious, something that unsettled me. My mind was spinning, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me. A mix of guilt and confusion overwhelmed me. I couldn't be feeling this way. I was his stepmother. This wasn't right. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he shrugged, his expression lightening again. All right, he said, his voice back to its usual carefree tone, but as he turned to leave, he shot me one last look. The kind of look that left my mind racing, questioning everything. As the door closed behind him, I felt a wave of relief, but also something else. Something I didn't want to admit. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still clutching the pillow to my chest, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I couldn't get the image of him out of my head, and I knew without a doubt that I would never look at Ethan the same way again. The evening passed in a blur, my thoughts spinning like a scratched record, trapped in a loop I couldn't escape. Dinner was just like any other night, nothing special. I made Victor's favorite roast chicken, served with mashed potatoes and green beans, just like the dinners I had prepared for years. I served him with a smile, but it didn't truly come from the heart, and he hardly noticed. He was always like that. His attention had long since shifted away from me and was entirely consumed by his hobbies: woodworking, gardening, solving puzzles, things that took up all his time and mind. As we ate, I tried to push Ethan out of my thoughts, but it was impossible. His face, his smile, his gaze, the way his eyes locked onto mine, never breaking, everything seemed to have changed. I found myself looking at him more than I wanted to admit, trying to pretend nothing had happened, trying to act normal when I couldn't shake the unspoken tension between us. But it was impossible. The weight of the unspoken tension between us pressed down on me like an unbearable burden. I looked over at Victor, who was still eating mindlessly, his eyes glued to the TV screen. An old sitcom rerun, the kind of pointless show he watched every night, never changing. He seemed content, lost in the familiarity of his predictable habits. Me? I was lost in my own thoughts. Although not about him. I didn't resent him, no. I knew the man I married, he was a good man, always working hard and caring for the family. But sometimes I felt invisible to him. I couldn't help but wonder if he still saw me, or if he only viewed me as a fixture in the house, something that had always been there, but never really noticed. Later that night, as Victor drifted off in his recliner, I caught a glimpse of Ethan again. He moved across the hallway, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He didn't even look at me. He didn't need to. I could feel his presence even when I wasn't looking directly at him. There was something about him, something that made my heart race whenever he was near. And yet, it wasn't just desire. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was something deeper, something harder to define, something dangerous. The house seemed quieter now that Victor was asleep. The hum of the TV the only sound filling the space. I pushed myself up from the couch, my movement stiff and mechanical as I started to clear the dinner plates. The clinking of the silverware in the sink was the only sound that filled the quiet air around me. I tried to focus on the task, on the normalcy of washing dishes, but it was hard. My mind kept returning to Ethan. That's when he walked into the kitchen. Barefoot, his hair still damp, falling loosely around his face. He wore a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, the clothes he usually wore at home. He was much taller than me now, looking more like a man than the boy I used to know. But when he looked at me with those eyes full of unspoken things, everything inside me seemed to freeze. "Hey," he said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. His movements were slow, as if he had all the time in the world. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. His gaze felt like it was pressing against me, holding me in place, making it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore the tension building between us, but it wasn't something I could ignore. Not anymore. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong here?" Ethan asked, his voice lower than usual, tinged with something vulnerable, as if he was searching for something in me. The question startled me. I couldn't think of an answer right away. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was this a question he was asking out of curiosity, or was it something deeper? Something more? I couldn't say. "What do you mean?" I asked, hoping he wouldn't notice the confusion in my eyes. He shrugged, his eyes still fixed on me. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I don't fit in here. Like I'm stuck in the wrong place." His words reverberated between us, heavy with meaning, and something inside me stirred. I couldn't explain it. The way his words struck me, bringing up feelings I hadn't acknowledged, feelings I had tried to bury. I felt the same way, like I was stuck in this life, in this house, in a role I no longer felt suited for. But I couldn't say that. Not to him. Not to Ethan. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. "You'll figure it out," I said softly, but even I wasn't sure. But when Ethan smiled, that warmth crept back into my chest, and I wondered if he was right. Was I stuck too? The morning after, everything seemed like it was supposed to be normal. I told myself that. The world was still spinning, the sun still rose in the sky, and life went on. But I couldn't shake the way Ethan had looked at me the night before, the weight of his gaze lingering even as the daylight seeped into the house. I tried to hide it, but there was no escaping it. We sat down to breakfast, and the clink of silverware filled the air as Victor shuffled through his crossword puzzle, his eyes half closed in concentration. Ethan was always the last to join us, and today was no different. He appeared at the kitchen door looking half asleep, his hair still damp from his shower, a towel loosely draped around his neck. He was wearing his usual comfortable clothes, worn sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, but even that simple look had an effect on me. I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes swept over me when he entered, that almost invisible flicker of recognition, the quiet, shared understanding of something unsaid. Victor didn't notice. He was too wrapped up in his puzzle, his mind lost in the intricacies of the clues in front of him. I envied that focus, that ability to be absorbed in something so trivial yet so all-consuming. It seemed easier than dealing with the tension that had appeared overnight between Ethan and me. As we ate, I couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Ethan's hand brushed mine more than once as we passed the salt, or when I refilled his coffee mug. Each touch felt deliberate. Each moment stretched out in slow motion, and I could feel my pulse quicken every time. I told myself it was nothing, just a simple accident. Nothing more than the natural motions of sitting together at the table. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. David, of course, didn't seem to notice. He was too wrapped up in his crossword puzzle, his mind occupied with words and clues and things that had nothing to do with the undercurrent of tension between Ethan and me. And somehow that made me feel even more isolated. There he was, content in his world of puzzles and the comfort of his routine, and there I was, drowning in this sudden, overwhelming awareness of Ethan. How had things changed so quickly? How had it gone from normal to whatever this was? After breakfast, Ethan did something unexpected. He offered to help clean up. It was strange. He usually disappeared into his room after a meal or went out with friends, but today he lingered. I should have said no. I should have insisted it was unnecessary, but I didn't. I let him stay. "We can handle it," I said, stacking the plates in the sink, trying to act as though everything was fine, as though nothing had changed. But my voice betrayed me. It sounded too tight, too hesitant, even to my own ears. "I want to," he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. His words were simple, but there was something in the way he said them. Something urgent that made my heart skip a beat. We worked in silence, the sound of dishes being washed the only thing between us. But the space between us felt different now, charged. Almost as if it were an electric field that neither of us wanted to step out of. And every time our hands brushed as we passed a dish or reached for a glass, it felt intentional. Like the space we shared had a weight to it that neither of us was willing to acknowledge. At one point, we both reached for the same glass. Our hands collided, and for a moment, neither of us pulled away. His hand lingered on mine longer than it should have, and I felt the heat of his touch seep into my skin like fire slowly spreading beneath the surface. My breath hitched, and I froze, unsure of what to do or how to react. He didn't pull away either. His fingers remained lightly pressed against mine, almost like an anchor, as if he were waiting for me to pull back, to end the contact. But I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't want to. Then his voice, quiet and serious, broke the silence. "You're different," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself more than to me. His gaze was locked onto mine, intense, searching. "You're not like other women your age. You actually see people. You listen." The words hit me like a cold splash of water, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't find a way to respond. What was he talking about? Was he trying to say something deeper? Was this just another careless remark, or was there more to it? "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding far more strained than I'd intended. I didn't know how to handle what he was saying. He stepped closer, not in a rush but with a kind of calm deliberation that unsettled me. His gaze softened just a little, but it was still full of that unspoken intensity. "You're real," he said, and his words seemed to settle into the air between us, hanging there like a weight we both couldn't deny. "You actually care. You don't hide behind facades like everyone else." I felt my stomach tighten, my chest constrict with something I couldn't name. His words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I had spent years trying to hide behind layers of politeness, behind the expectations of being a wife, a mother, someone who always had everything together. But here he was reading me, peeling back those layers with a simple observation. It was unsettling. How could he see me like that? How could he read me so clearly? I wanted to step back, to distance myself from him. From this moment, I wanted to flee from the heat of his touch, the weight of his gaze. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, caught between the desire to break free and the inexplicable pull to stay close. Just then, David called from the other room, his voice interrupting the moment. "Melina, where's my crossword book?" The spell was broken. Ethan pulled away, giving me a small, knowing smile. It was a smile that felt like a secret shared between us, one that Victor would never understand. Without saying a word, Ethan turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call after him, to stop him, to say something, anything, but I couldn't. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. The silence in the room felt louder than ever as I continued to stand there, my hands still frozen in place, my pulse racing. I hated how much I didn't want him to leave. The days that followed were nothing but a blur, each one bleeding into the next, until the line between yesterday and today had become indistinguishable. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about the way he made me feel. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, they were small, seemingly inconsequential moments, but each one left a mark on me, a mark that seemed to deepen with each passing day. I tried to bury the thoughts, to push them down into the recesses of my mind where they could stay locked away. But no matter how hard I tried, they kept resurfacing, swirling in my thoughts like a dangerous storm. The mornings were the worst. Victor, as predictable as ever, would be buried in his crossword puzzle, lost in the world of letters and clues. And me, I'd find myself constantly looking over at Ethan, even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew it would only lead to more confusion, more heartache. Each time I met his gaze, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. The brief exchanges, the glances we shared, felt like forbidden fruit, tempting and sweet, yet dangerous and reckless. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it all seemed to explode. The house was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the otherwise still air. I was putting away the groceries, carefully organizing the items in the cabinets, trying to distract myself from the ache in my chest. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting, and with each step I took, I could feel his presence growing closer. Then there he was, Ethan. I hadn't heard him approach, but the moment he stepped into the kitchen, everything else faded away. His presence was overwhelming, a force that filled the room. I froze, my back still turned toward him, unable to move, unable to breathe. He was standing so close behind me, just within arm's reach. And I could feel the heat of his body radiating toward me. My heart raced, my pulse quickened, and before I could even register what was happening, his hand brushed against mine as he reached for a glass. The touch, even as brief as it was, sent a shock through my body, like an electric jolt that ran through my veins, igniting every nerve. I quickly pulled my hand away, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating, building with each passing second. His voice broke through the silence, low and steady. "Are you avoiding me?" I turned to face him, but I couldn't meet his eyes. His gaze was too intense, too knowing. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "No," I replied quickly, my voice faltering, betraying me. I was lying and I knew it. I was avoiding him, but it wasn't because I didn't want him around. It was because I knew how dangerous it was to feel this way. How wrong it was to want him, to crave his touch. Ethan didn't back down. He took a step closer. And I could feel the air between us grow thicker, heavier, like it was charged with something far beyond words. "Why do you always act like you don't want to be around me?" he pressed. His voice a little more insistent, a little more demanding. "I can see it, you know. I see the way you look at me." His words were a challenge, and I couldn't deny the truth in them. He was right, I had been avoiding him. Every glance, every touch, every moment I spent with him felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't control. It wasn't just the physical attraction that I couldn't deny, it was the emotional connection, the way he seemed to see right through me, the way he made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him to stop, to tell him to back away before it was too late. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tell him to stop because, deep down, I didn't want him to. I didn't want to walk away from the feeling of being seen, being understood. In a way, I had been craving this, craving him, long before I'd ever admitted it to myself. Before I could stop myself. I found my hand reaching out toward him. It was like I had no control over my own body, no ability to stop what was happening. I closed the space between us in an instant, and without thinking, my lips were on his. The kiss was inevitable. It wasn't something that I had planned, something that I had even consciously decided to do. It was like a floodgate had opened. And all the emotions I had been trying to bury, guilt, longing, desire, came rushing to the surface in a wave I couldn't stop. His lips were warm and insistent against mine. And I found myself leaning into him, unable to pull away. Every touch, every movement, felt like a magnetic force drawing me deeper into him. I felt my hands move to his chest. Fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as if holding onto something solid, something that would ground me in this moment. But nothing grounded me. The more I gave into it, the more it felt like I was falling, tumbling into something I knew was dangerous but couldn't resist. My body was responding to him in ways I had never expected. The need for him was consuming, overwhelming and all-encompassing. When we finally pulled apart, reality crashed back in like a bucket of cold water. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest, and I stepped back from him. The cold air between us now feeling like a chasm. What had we just done? What had I just done? "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to push away the rush of guilt and confusion that was swirling in my mind. This was wrong. I knew that. I couldn't let this happen again, couldn't let myself get lost in this. But a part of me didn't want to stop. A part of me wanted more, wanted him. And that part scared me more than anything else. I knew it was dangerous, knew it couldn't continue. But I couldn't stop the longing that was building inside me. It was like a fire, and I was standing too close, unable to move away from the heat. Ethan's expression was unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his chest rising and falling with every breath. The silence between us was deafening. But in that silence, I knew something had changed. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And though I was terrified of where it might lead, a part of me couldn't deny that I wanted more. And so we stood there in the quiet of the kitchen. Our breaths the only sound, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing that whatever it would be impossible to undo. My lips were still warm from the kiss, and each breath seemed to awaken a storm of emotions that I couldn't quench. The feeling was dizzying, like I was floating in a space full of ambiguity with no solid ground beneath me anymore. Part of me wanted to throw it all away, to dive back into him, to continue this moment forever. But another part, my rational mind, screamed for me to stop, to regain control. Ethan stood across from me, not coming any closer, but I could feel the tension still hanging thick in the air between us. He looked at me, his eyes now lacking the eager spark, replaced by something more serious, as if he too realized everything had changed, but we couldn't deny what had just occurred. "Hey," Ethan began, his voice low, a little hesitant, as if he was trying to find the right words to explain himself. But I didn't let him continue. "Don't," I interrupted, my voice soft but firm, like a way to halt the storm that was rising within me. "What have we done, Ethan?" I turned away, unable to meet his gaze any longer. I shook my head, my eyes welling up with tears, even though I tried to hold them back. I can't do this." I felt like I was standing between two worlds. One world was everything I had known, my family, Victor, the choices I had lived by all these years. But there was another world waiting for me, a world where I felt free, where I could be myself, where the feelings I had buried for so long could finally surface. I turned back to face him. And this time, it wasn't the naive look of a man seeking a response anymore. Instead, that look contained resolve. A part of him was hurting too, but still accepting it as something that couldn't be changed. He slowly stepped closer, his eyes not leaving mine, but not touching me either. It was like he was trying to give me some comfort. But at the same time, he knew that nothing could be fixed anymore. "We can't go back, can we?" His voice cracked slightly, as if he was admitting the harsh truth. Something broke inside me. A feeling of choking I couldn't name. He was right. We couldn't go back. We had crossed a line, and now, no matter how much we wanted to regret it, there was no turning back. Everything was too far gone. I took a deep breath, but I felt suffocated. "I don't know if this is right," I whispered, my eyes still locked on his. I wanted to see some reaction from him. To know if he felt the same confusion, fear, something unclear. I wondered if all these feelings were worth it, if I really wanted to go down this path. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stood there, his breath blending into the air, quiet and heavy. His eyes still locked onto mine, but it seemed like he was searching for something in me, looking for an explanation for what we had just done. I didn't know if he could understand the turmoil I was feeling. "Maybe we should stop," I said, my voice more resolute this time. Although I didn't know what I was saying, part of me still wanted to push him away, still wanted to keep some distance, to not get lost in something we couldn't undo. But Ethan moved closer to me, no longer waiting. His gaze was once again filled with determination, like he couldn't escape this path. "No, Melina, we can't stop," he said, his voice deep, full of resolve. "You know that." Once again, I couldn't resist. We had crossed that line, and I could feel that there was no going back, no stopping anymore. This time, as he stepped closer to me, I couldn't push him away. The feeling was no longer something distant. We both stood there, caught in a powerful wave, unable to swim against it. And I didn't want to stop. Ethan kissed me again, this time without hesitation. He was sure in every movement, and I felt myself completely surrender to him. His lips were warm, firm, and full of desire, and I, despite all my efforts, couldn't pull away. When we finally broke apart, I felt like I couldn't stop anymore. The feeling of guilt and confusion surged within me, but deep inside I knew one thing. We couldn't go back. But I still wondered, was this really right? Did I really want to go down this road? And in that moment I knew we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The days that followed felt like I was drifting in a haze, where everything was distorted and nothing seemed real anymore. I couldn't escape the guilt, the shame, the suffocating weight of what I had done. It clung to me like a second skin, making every breath feel heavier, every thought more twisted. And yet, despite it all, the pull between Ethan and me was stronger than ever. I tried to keep my distance. I told myself over and over that I had to stop, that this was wrong, that I had to push him away, that I couldn't allow myself to continue down this path. But every time I saw him, every time our hands brushed against each other, the temptation grew. It was like a fire igniting in my chest, a fire I couldn't control. Every look he gave me, every soft touch, seemed to melt away any resolve I had left. I found myself thinking about him more and more, dreaming about him when I closed my eyes at night. It wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional. Something deeper, something I hadn't expected to happen. He was becoming a part of me in a way I couldn't explain, and I hated myself for it. I tried to convince myself that I was just in a moment of weakness, that it was a temporary lapse, that I'd snap out of it soon enough. But I didn't. I couldn't. I felt like I was being pulled under by something that wasn't entirely within my control. Victor, of course, began to notice. He wasn't blind, and while he wasn't the most observant person, there were enough signs for him to pick up on the growing distance between us. It was subtle at first, the lingering silences, the small glances, the moments when I would freeze up in Ethan's presence. But then it started to show. I couldn't pretend anymore. Victor's sharp eyes, always a little too observant, started to catch the tension in the air between me and Ethan. One evening, it all came crashing down. I had been sitting in the living room with Victor on the couch as usual, but my mind was miles away. Ethan, I knew, was in the other room, his presence like a heavy weight pressing on me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I kept stealing glances at him when I thought Victor wasn't looking, feeling a sense of guilt gnawing at me. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but they wouldn't leave. The temptation was unbearable. I couldn't stand it any longer. I told myself I needed to escape, even if just for a moment, to breathe, to think. So I excused myself from the living room under the pretense of checking something in the bedroom. It wasn't an obvious move, but I needed to be near Ethan, and I had to do something to ease the gnawing tension inside me. As I walked toward the bedroom, I felt Victor's gaze follow me, but I didn't look back. I knew he wouldn't question it, not yet. His attention was on his crossword puzzles, as it always was. But deep down, I could feel his quiet suspicion starting to stir, though it hadn't fully emerged. Once I reached the bedroom, I shut the door behind me quietly. Ethan was still there, and for a moment it was just the two of us, our breathing steady but heavy. The silence between us louder than words. It wasn't long before the door to the living room opened slowly. I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Then I froze. I knew. Victor had noticed. The door to the living room creaked, and I turned to find Victor standing there, his face a mixture of confusion, anger, and something else, betrayal. His eyes flicked between me and Ethan, the truth slowly dawning on him. The moment he entered the room, I felt the tension spike, thick and suffocating. I could see it in his eyes. He knew. He knew something was wrong. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his gaze flicking between Ethan and me. Ethan, standing just behind me, was unusually still. His usual confidence had slipped, replaced with something else, guilt, maybe? Or something darker that I couldn't place. But then Victor spoke, his voice cold and harsh, breaking the silence. What the hell is going on here? His words cut through the air like a knife, and the force of them sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't yelling, not yet, but there was a quiet fury in his voice that was worse than any shouting. I tried to speak, to explain, but my voice was caught in my throat. I couldn't find the words, and I was certain that even if I could, they wouldn't be enough to fix this. The look on his face told me everything. He had already figured it out. I asked you a question, Victor repeated, his tone hardening. What the hell is going on with you two? Ethan, still silent, took a step forward, his body tense. He was standing his ground, but I could see the way his eyes shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't as sure of himself now. This was the breaking point. The moment when the illusion of normalcy shattered. You're out, Victor said, his voice colder than ice. You're not welcome here anymore. Just like that, it was over. The words hit me like a slap, and I felt like the floor had been pulled out from beneath me. Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name, regret, anger, or perhaps a quiet understanding. Maybe he realized it too, that this couldn't continue, that it was over, even if neither of us wanted it to be. He didn't say anything as he began to gather his things. I wanted to say something, to stop him, to beg him to stay, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching as he packed his bag, his movements slow and deliberate. Every item he placed in his bag felt like another piece of me slipping away. When he was done, he turned toward me one last time. The silence between us stretched on, thick with everything we hadn't said. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. This isn't over, he said quietly before walking out the door. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house, and for a moment, everything was still. My heart felt like it had stopped, like time had frozen in place. I was left standing in the empty room, with nothing but the weight of my own decisions pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Victor was still in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was unreadable, and I couldn't tell if he was angry, hurt, or simply numb. But whatever it was, I knew I had destroyed something irreparable. I had lost something that could never be regained. The days that followed were unbearable. The house felt empty, silent. without Ethan's presence filling the spaces. I tried to act as if everything was normal, but the guilt consumed me. It gnawed at me, biting into my skin, filling me with regret. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one responsible for what had happened. Victor had been so distant, so lost in his own world that I couldn't help but wonder if he had seen the signs, if he had known deep down that something was wrong long before everything came to light. But that didn't matter now. It was done. Ethan was gone, and I was left with nothing but the empty space he had left behind and the weight of my own actions. I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't take back the choices I had made, and the consequences were now inescapable. As the days dragged on, the guilt grew stronger, but so did the longing. Deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was too much left unresolved, too much between Ethan and me that couldn't be simply erased. We had crossed a line, yes, but that line wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot.